Welcome, everybody. I welcome you to the Mainstream Indie Music Podcast, where we cover everything indie music, and now we have so for a little over a year. It's amazing to think about. I welcome the 286 subscribers to this channel, and of course, any guests or new ones that have been coming in and listening. I welcome you, and feel free to subscribe. Please feel free to join us, see what other videos interest you. This week is an interesting pick, Interpol. I didn't think of... I also, by the way, I am notorious for this amongst my friends. I might mispronounce their name or flip-flop the pronunciation of their name throughout this entire video. I apologize. I would blame my accent, or I would blame... I don't know. I would blame anything else. But to be honest with you, it's just something that I'm probably just going to mess up during this video. So I apologize to you fans of them. I heavily apologize. They're a really interesting group. This is one that they've been on my mind while on the course of making this music channel. And I decided to finally do the research on them and move forward. Now, one interesting fact about them is, and it's in the shorts for this channel, but they were really a part of that New York indie music scene of the early 2000s, a la the Strokes, the National, and the Yeah Yeah Yeahs. I couldn't imagine just during this time the New York indie underground, is just consisted of those groups and Interpol. It's just an amazing concept that all of them were getting going at the same time. And Interpol they didn't really know how far they were going to go with this group. Paul Banks was the one that came up with the name. He is definitely one of the founding members, vocals and guitar. He was born in England, but he moved to the United States when he was 5. So he was the one that came up with the name. And what's kind of cool is he really likes to have secrecy in his personal life. He really doesn't like people to know what's going on. He kind of goes by a stage name as well. And if you're like myself, Turn on the Bright Lights was their debut album, and probably the album that got you into them. You were a huge fan of them because of that album. This album was formed after 5 years of them being together in college, and it was all the way back in 2002. So over 20 years ago, this album was released. And this has Obstacle 1 on it, PDA's on it, and NYC is on it as well. And this album alone, it just launched them into the stratosphere amongst those other great New York indie groups that I mentioned earlier. And what is interesting is its kind of mark on indie music in general. So, for example, let me kind of tell you what I mean. The Killers cite it as their biggest inspiration, especially Obstacle 1. And what's interesting is Brandon Flowers from The Killers, in an interview, kind of expressed what Interpol means to them, and especially that album, Turn on the Bright Lights, where he said at that time, in the early 2000s, you had the Strokes and the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, but there was another band who was more mysterious and darker. Their first album, Interpol's first album, was on constant rotation while they were making Hot Fuss. So, you imagine them creating such a big impact on the Killers at the time, which, of course, several years later, they would release their debut album, Hot Fuss. It's such an honor, such an honor. What's kind of funny, though, is with all of the, definitely people look back on Turn on the Bright Lights now and see it as like one of the top indie albums of all time. But it did not start that way, even amongst the indie community. It only peaked at 158 in the Billboard Top 200, and it failed to even make the top 100 in the UK albums chart. during the time, it sold over 15,000 copies, which, you got to imagine, like, okay, that's a pretty decent, number. But, even amongst the indie crowd, that's not that many albums, especially being a New York City band. But this album had been written before 2011 or 9/11. And because of the hold that it was kind of, or the momentum that it was kind of getting in New York City, it really helped drive the success of that album as well. And, during the time, they were touring with bands like The Cure, TV on the radio, definitely left an impression on them as well. And the one last thing, we're not going to spend our entire time on this album, but one last thing is the album cover is a picture that was actually taken in London and just kind of filtered with a red hue on top of it. So, just some interesting facts about that album. Definitely is one of the biggest reasons why they got the success where they are today. However, 3 years later, Antics, their second album, was released on Matador Records. So they switched their record label. You have some pretty popular songs off that one as well, like Slow Hands and Evil. The music video, so the previous album is their most famous album, but the music video for the song Evil is probably their most well-known because it shows a lifelike puppet surviving a car wreck. A lot of people wonder what this song is about, and maybe in the future we are going to have an entire video about this song, but they say there is no like super dark meaning. Some people think it's about serial killers. Who knows? In 2007, Interpol switched to a much bigger record company, Capitol Records, with their third album, Our Love to Admire. You had the Heinrich Maneuver, No I and Threesome, and Rest My Chemistry. Their 2010, their bassist had left the band, and actually, instead of finding a replacement, their lead singer decided to play bass instead. Their self-titled album came out later that year in September of 2010. You had Barricade and Lights, and their fifth album, El Pintor, was released in 2014, along with Marauder in 2018. What's interesting throughout this whole thing, Interpol, they really don't claim to have the massive success and following that they do. These guys have been on the road for over 20 years. I can't even imagine the amount of people that they've toured with. I can't imagine the famous bands that have opened up for them, that they themselves have opened up for. And Interpol, at the end of the day, really fits in that crowd that I talk about, where I don't really know how else, or like what other direction musically they would even go. I definitely stick them into that crowd of, they have now found their crowd of people to play to. They have found their fan base, and they are perfectly happy just releasing music that they want to release, that their fans want to hear. I don't think they have any ambition of trying to become bigger on the music scene. I mean, they're already massive, especially, like I said, in New York and Europe. And yeah, more power to them. I wish them the best in their, not that they need it from me, but wish them the best in their endeavors. Now, that is all that I had on Interpol, their history, where they came from, and of course their famous first album. And I will talk to y'all next week. Bye.